So like Dan said, I'm the nutrient management lead for CVA. Got a master's in agronomy from UNL, so I got lots of pieces of paper that say I'm supposed to know what the hell I'm talking about. You guys can decide for yourselves when we get done here. So Dan asked me to do two things. One was how to understand soil test, and the other one was talk a little bit about improving nitrogen use efficiency. So I'm going to try to, I think I got 5 hours, so we got plenty of time to cover this. Cation exchange capacity is the first place I start whenever I'm looking at a soil test, because without knowing that, and what cation exchange capacity does is tell you the texture of your soil. So basically, if you've got a CC below 10, you're pretty sandy. 10 to 15 is more of a sand-silt mix. 15 to 20, you got more and more silt. As you get into the higher 20s, you got more and more clay. So again, soil texture is made up of a mixture of sand, silt, and clay. Sand doesn't hold nutrients or water near as well as silt and clay. And what you look at is what's your ability to hold nutrients, what's your ability to hold water, and manage accordingly. So I've got a soil here down in the Platte River Valley by Monroe with a CEC of 5, and I got a soil up here by the Sioux City with a CEC of 50. You're definitely going to want to manage those a little bit different. The CEC of 5, you can make a nice playground for your children to play with their toys. And the CEC of 50, if you ever decide you want to brick your house, that's a good place to go to start making. That CEC of 50 is going to be a problem managing nitrogen and water just as much as the CEC of 5. A 50 like that has got a tremendous amount of clay in it. It's going to hold nitrogen from leaching, but it's going to tend to hold a lot of water, and it's going to want to denitrify. That CEC of 5 is going to tend to leach a lot. A rule of thumb that we'll put out there sometimes is if you apply no more than 10 pounds of nitrogen for every CEC, you shouldn't have a lot of risk of leaching as long as you're not applying it too far ahead of the growing season. But if you try to apply more than that, so if you apply 150 pounds of nitrogen in one shot in a CEC of 5 or 4.5, you're definitely going to leach some. You really should be splitting that application up a lot more. So your CEC doesn't change. So if you're farming the same ground you've always been farming and you've got some soil tests out there, you kind of know what you're dealing with. But if you pick up a new piece of ground, it's pretty important to get that number just to understand what you're dealing with, especially in this Platte River Valley or any other river valley where you've got a lot of alluvial soils. You can have a lot of variation that you're not expecting in this cation exchange capacity. And again, it's its indication of its ability to hold water and nutrients. So you get these light ones, they tend to drain water through fast, and when they drain water through fast, if you've got nitrate in there, it's going to take the nitrate with it. These heavier soils, these CECs of the 20s are more normal. This 50 is an anomaly. We'll talk about that in a little bit. These CECs in the 20s will tend to hold water and nitrogen a lot better, but that 10 pounds of nitrogen for every CEC, it starts to lose its validity as you get into the 20s. Applying 200 pounds plus of nitrogen in any one shot, even though you're not likely to leach it in these soils, they tend to hold a little bit more water, you're going to denitrify, you're wasting that nitrogen. And we just had a change in administration here, I guess in a couple hours. Whether you like it or not, we're going to focus a lot more on greenhouse gas emissions, and nitrous oxide is a tremendous greenhouse gas. They're going to put a kibosh on that a little bit. So we don't want to waste nitrogen, whether it's going into the groundwater that you're going to have to drink, or whether it goes in the atmosphere that we're going to have to start accounting for a little bit more. Enough on CEC. As I work through a soil report, this is something that kind of confuses people too, is we read from left to right, up to down. That's not how I read a soil report. As an agronomist, the first thing I want to know is what's my soil's ability to hold nutrients and water so I manage accordingly. Second is what is Mother Nature's ability to provide nutrients so I don't have to buy them. Now that I work for the co-op now, so I'd love to sell you nutrients, but if I just waste your money, you're not going to be happy with me, you're going to go somewhere else anyway. So let's account for the nutrients that are going to be released in organic matter. Organic matter is a tremendous source of nitrogen. That's why it's in the calculations Dan just gave you. Tremendous source of phosphorus. So even though we make most of our phosphorus recommendations off the phosphorus soil test over here, understanding if you've got a nice amount of organic matter, you might not have to push the recommendation quite so hard from what the part per million is telling you. It's also a great source of sulfur. So again, we make our sulfur recommendations off the sulfur test, but how far we need to push that recommendation, a lot of that information is going to come with how much organic matter we have. It's also a source of micronutrients. So knowing the organic matter percentage and how much Mother Nature is going to provide, so I know how much I need to supplement as a professional agronomist, helps me a lot in doing my job. After those two, cation exchange capacity number one, organic matter number two. Third is soil pH. I'm jumping around, but there's a reason for it. Because for me to make a good recommendation in the nutrients that you spend money on, I need to understand the soil's ability to hold nutrients, the soil's ability to provide nutrients on its own, and lastly, that chemical reaction that I can expect those nutrients to have in the soil to whether or not they're going to be available to your crop. Getting your soil pH in the right place is generally the best money that you can spend. Even though we make a lot more margin on nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium than we ever make on ag lime, if you don't have this one right, the things that we try to do with phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, and nitrogen aren't going to work as well as they should. For corn and soybean production around here, I would like your soil pH to be somewhere between 6.3 and 7.0. 6.3 and 6.8 is probably really the sweet spot. As you get above that, it gets tough to make much corrections. I generally talk about things you can do to manage around it, but as you get below that, there's a simple process. It's called lime that will fix that soil pH. pH is active hydrogen in the soil solution. That's what the laboratory is measuring. And I spent 11 years at Midwest Laboratories, but I've got all the respect in the world for Ray Ward and the folks at Servitech or the folks at Ag Source. I don't care which laboratory you're using. They pretty much do the same things to come up with CEC, soil pH, and soil organic matter. So it's pretty much all apples to apples. We'll talk about some apples and oranges later as we get to phosphorus, but for pH, CEC, and organic matter, it's all the same. They add water to your soil, they stick a pH probe in there, and that's the active hydrogen that's in the soil. That's what your crop's got to grow in. And more importantly, for nutrient management, that's what the soil microbes that are going to break down that organic matter and provide those free nutrients have got to live in. And if that's a good environment for them, they're going to provide more nutrients from breaking down the organic matter, and they're less likely, and so is the soil chemistry, less likely to tie up those nutrients in forms unavailable to the plant. So I'd like you to get your pH in a good place. If you're below 6, it's time to lime. I told you this one here with the CEC at 53 was a little bit of an anomaly. A 4.6 is a train wreck. Soil life doesn't do very well there. Aluminum starts to react in the soil and create additional hydrogen. Kind of becomes a chain reaction that you need to stop. And the only way to stop it is lots of ag lime. The buffer index. A lot of guys will confuse these two. The soil pH is the pH of your soil that your crop's got to grow in and the microbial life have to live in. The buffer index is just an indication of how much total acidity is in that soil. So the way I relate it to guys is the soil pH is the temperature of your bath water. The buffer index tells you how big your bathtub is. So you don't want to get the heck burned out of you or to freeze as you step into the bathtub. But if the bathtub's the size of an Olympic swimming pool, it's going to take a lot more normal temperature water to correct that temperature. It's the same thing with lime. This thing here with a CEC really heavy soil of 53, very low pH, it's the bathtub the size of the Olympic swimming pool. That lime recommendation is going to be around 12 times. Don't apply that all in 1 year. It took somebody a long time to screw this soil up this bad. You should probably take a little bit of time to try to get it fixed, but it's going to take a lot of lime. Now, frankly, the first thing I would do with this soil as far out of whack as it looks is I call the laboratory and ask them to run it again, or I'd go out there and take a couple more soil samples before I spend 13 ton on lime. Maybe I want to double check that all those numbers are right. But bottom line is I need to understand the soil's ability to hold nutrients and water, the soil's ability to provide nutrients with the organic matter, and that soil pH, get it as right as I can to let everything work to the best of its potential before I start spending money on it. Even though I want your money. That's what pays my salary. After those two, those three, I generally move to what pays the bills as far as what most growers are going to have to spend the most money on in nutrients that they purchase from their cooperative. So phosphorus. This is the P1 grade test. That's what Midwest Laboratories runs. That's also what AgSource runs. Servitech and Ward run the Malic 3 test. There's a little difference in the two. Generally, the P1 Bray number is just a little bit lower than the Malic 3. On the P1 Bray, I like that number for ground that, especially ground that I own, to be around 25 part per million. If I'm really pushing high yields, like in dry land, I'm pushing 250 consistently or above, or in irrigated, I'm pushing 280 or above consistently, I might shoot for more around 30 part per million. If I got the Malic 3 test from Ward, I'd probably just add about 5 part per million each of those two numbers. 30 on the normal yield, 35 on really high yield. If my yields are a little lower, so a little bit tougher ground, then maybe I wouldn't push quite so hard. In the P1 Bray, I might shoot for 20, Malic 3 shoot for 25. A couple numbers to keep in mind. Corn takes off about 0.35 to 0.4 pounds of P2O5 for every bushel that you take off of there. The amount of phosphorus that you need to apply, if you're below those targets I just gave you, needs to be more than that number. So if you're taking off 200 bushel corn, you're taking off about 80 pounds of P2O5, that's an equivalent to 150 pounds of MAP. If you're applying less than 150 pounds of MAP, you're mining. If you're applying more than 150 pounds of MAP, you're building. Pretty much that simple. There's a place I want you to get to. I'd like you to stay there. You can do that by replacing crop removal. If you're a lot higher than that, maybe you got some history manure, apply a little less than that, let it mine a little bit. If you're a lot lower than that, you just haven't kept up with the fertilizer, you need to apply a little bit more than you're taking off, slowly you'll build over time. The P2 Bray, I won't go too far into that, but for Midwest Labs, they kind of use that as a quality control check and a little bit additional information. Your recommendations we make off the P1. We don't use the P2 in the rec much, other than to understand if it's a lot higher than a 1-to-2 ratio, there's a lot of tie-up there, like this soil right here. P1 of 8, not much available phosphorus, but an incredible amount of phosphorus in the P2. That generally happens in high pH soils, and that's what's going on here. I'd figure out a way to manage around that. Maybe strip till, maybe trying to put a little bit more sulfur and nitrogen with that phosphorus to keep it available a little bit longer. I try to do something a little bit different. Any questions so far? Potassium. I want you somewhere around 200 part per million. If you're below that, we need to apply crop removal plus a little build. In these sands, like this one right here, they don't tend to hold potassium very well. Sometimes I give up on trying to build the 200 part per million. I just say you need to be north of crop removal to try to build a little bit, but because the soil doesn't hold those nutrients very well, a lot of times I just can't build like I normally do. Again, that's why I start with CC, because I don't want to have unrealistic expectations of what I can get this number to. Okay? If you're a lot above that, maybe you don't need to make any application. If you're kind of in a range of around 200, 250 part per million, we like to kind of keep you there. If you're below, say, 180 part per million, we're definitely going to want you building. So as you look through there, a lot of these soils are pretty high in potassium. It wouldn't make a lot of sense to spend money on potassium here. Might try to do a little something in season. That's something we see with a lot of nutrients, especially nitrogen, potassium, and sulfur. Sometimes it's hard to do everything before the growing season to meet the demand when corn's at V8 to R2. When you're rapidly growing or you're rapidly trying to build grain, a lot of times supplementing a little nutrients is a good thing to do. Once I get past potassium, I don't spend a lot of time on magnesium or calcium in the part per million. I do the base saturations. I'd like your potassium base saturation to be between 3 and 5%. Magnesium base saturation to be between 12 and 18%. Calcium base saturation to be between 65 and 75%. If you're off on the calcium, the first thing I do is go look at pH. If you need a lime, and that's generally going to fix a lot of this. If the mag base saturation is really high, which it's not in any of these soils, then a lot of times we'll make a recommendation for gypsum to try to bring that down. It seems like high mag soils, you can improve the nitrogen efficiency if you bring the mag down by adding gypsum. Any questions?
Yeah, on the base saturation, what was it you said again for the potassium, magnesium?
Yep, 3 to 5% on potassium. 12 to 18% on the magnesium, and 65 to 75% on the calcium. Sometimes the high pH soils, the calcium will be a little higher, like right here. I don't worry about that too much because I've got 92% calcium and only 2% potassium. Those two could interfere with each other a little bit. The part per million down here is telling me I need potassium anyway, but if it told me I didn't need potassium and these are my ratios, I might add a little potassium even though the part per million is telling me not to. I make my recommendations primarily off the part per million, and then I might supplement that with the information come from base saturation. Sometimes guys like the hefty boys will focus on the base saturation. I start with part per million first. All right, sulfur. Sulfur test is the worst test on this report. It's a piece of crap. So if it's telling me I don't need any sulfur, I really question it. Like this one, at 114 part per million, that's a ridiculously high sulfur number. It's telling me one of two things. Either this soil doesn't drain very well at all, because sulfur, especially in sulfate, forms a mobile nutrient a lot like nitrate. If it's just sitting there and water can't move through it, a lot of times it'll build up. That's a drainage issue. That's not a fertility issue. I need to try to figure that out. The other time it can be really high is if the guy's using an amendment like waste gypsum that you get from power plants, or Cargill sells it, and they've put on a ton of it. You'll get really high sulfur numbers. I've seen numbers as high as 600 part per million for guys that were using gypsum to try to correct a low mag soil. Now you look at this mag, I told you I wanted to do between 12 and 18%. This is the lowest mag percentage on here. Looks like maybe they threw a whole bunch of gypsum on there that maybe they didn't really need, and it washed a bunch of the mag out. I don't know. I'd have to talk to the grower and see what the history is, but that is an outlier. That's another thing to look for. Look for your outliers, like this 53, and make sure you can explain why before you even use that information. If you can't explain why that outlier is there, like, you know, you got a bunch of nitrate tests and you're averaging 25 pounds of nitrate, but all of a sudden there's this one over here that's 118. If you can't explain why, don't use that information. Go out there and take another sample and make sure it's right. Because what can happen here with nitrates is you've got, say, a band. Let's just say that you did a side dress and then it went dry and you had a bunch of nitrogen. You just happen to hit that band with your probe. Well, that's going to give you a number like this. And that number is not appropriate for your entire field or even for the 40 acres you're sampling for. You get a really high number and it doesn't make any sense. Now, I expect high nitrate numbers this year because we had dry, pretty long growing season, good mineralization, and not a lot of water moving through the system either to leach nitrogen out or denitrify. And especially if your yields were a little lower than you expected, that's perfect for having a little bit high nitrates. That's valid. It's across your entire field. Take credit for that. But if it's not valid, if you go back out there and take 3 more samples in that area and it's not showing up, that's just telling you you hit a hot spot. It's really a bear with trying to do in-season checks when you've done anhydrous ammonia. Because anhydrous ammonia, you inject that in there, it stays within about 4 to 6 inches of that band for quite a long time. And you stick the probe right in there, you're going to get some really hot numbers, and they're not valid for the whole field. Go ahead, Ian.
If you have a carryover of, say, 60 pounds for this coming year, would you take, off your soil test, would you take credit for all 60?
So everybody's got a little bit different formula. So as long as you're using like Midwest Labs formula or you're using CDA's formula, the answer is yes. The University of Nebraska formula gets a little tight, so I'd be a little more careful with that one. What we used to do at Midwest Labs is we'd give full credit for that first 8 inches because we figured that's still going to be there. We only gave 75% credit when we made our formulas for that deep sample because we figured some of that was going out of the root zone. If you get real tight, and we'll talk about this when we talk about nitrogen use efficiency, if you get real tight, you're really pushing down your application, normally you're applying 180, but through the formula and through your measurements, you say, you know what, I think I can get by with 130 this year. Fine. But maybe around V6, you go back there and do a pre-site dress nitrate test just to double check where you're at before the corn turns yellow and you're all pissed off to go out for screwing up your nitrogen. I told you the sulfur number was crap. What we normally do is we shoot for around 20 part per million. If you're less than that, we make an application. If you're more than that, we might say you don't necessarily need it according to the soil test, but be a little careful dropping it to nothing. Some guys say, forget the soil test, I'm just going to apply 10% of my nitrogen and sulfur. So I apply 150 pounds of nitrogen, I apply 15 pounds of sulfur. As your organic matter is lower, be more careful cutting your sulfur. Because you don't have a lot that Mother Nature's going to supply for you. And especially in these sandy soils that tend to wash sulfate through them just about as fast as nitrate, I'd be real careful dropping that recommendation to 0, even if that number was 25 part per million. Because it probably isn't going to stick around all the way through the growing season. All right, zinc. I'd like it about 2 part per million. If you're 2 part per million or above, a little zinc in your starter is always a good idea, no problem there, but I don't know that you need much in your dry program. If you're below 2 part per million, we'd suggest you put some in your dry program, get it up to around 2 part per million. You don't remove a lot of zinc. I told you what your removal was for corn and phosphorus, at 0.4 pounds per bushel. Soybeans, it's about 0.8 pounds per bushel. Potassium, I didn't tell you that one, it's about a 0.3 pounds per bushel of potassium. K2O per bushel of corn. For soybeans, it's about 1.2 pounds of K2O per bushel of soybeans. Sulfur, it's about 1/10 of a pound per bushel of corn. To be honest with you, I don't remember the soybean off the top of my head. Zinc, it's only about 1/10 of a pound of zinc for all 200 bushels of corn. You don't take off much zinc. So build isn't as important here. We just try to get you to a good place. Or crop removal isn't as important here. We just try to get you a good place to keep you there. I'm going to blow through these. Manganese, I'd like you over 10, 12 part per million. Iron, like you somewhere over 30 part per million. Copper, I'd like you around 1 part per million. Boron, around 0.8 part per million. Excess lime, what that is they add a little acid to the soil and see if it bubbles or not. If it bubbles, you got free calcium carbonate sitting in the soil. If for some reason you are trying to lower your soil pH, which I don't recommend, you'd be working against this if you had excess lime sitting there, because whatever you do to try to lower it, it's going to react that excess lime first before it makes any dent in the soil pH. Soluble salts, I want you below about a 0.8. As that gets higher, it just tells you got too much salts there. A lot of times that comes from a lot of manure, especially like a hog lagoon going through a pivot, something like that, where you got years and years of salt accumulation. If that number starts creeping up on you, like this sample right here, figure out why and quit doing it. Questions? I told you 5 hours. We'll probably be a little shorter than that. And we'll see if I do any better than you did at the advancer. Ooh, I got it right once. All right. Why would we start a nitrogen presentation with pH? Goes back to what I was telling you about the soil test. If it's not right, everything else you do is kind of screwed up. So when you start getting below 6, I told you I want you to be somewhere in that 6.3 to 6.8, kind of a sweet spot for corn and soybeans. You know, 6.3 to 7 is a good place to be. As you start getting below 6, look what happens to nitrogen availability. Go down and down and down. Remember that 4.6 pH? There's a reason, and as a heavy soil, there's a reason it's a 13-ton lime recommendation, because you're really screwing things up with it, and a lot of things. So what happens with nitrogen, especially, is the soil biology just doesn't work very well in those pHs. So it's not only half of the nitrogen you apply ever makes into your crop. And if you're applying 150 pounds of nitrogen trying to raise 200 bushel of corn, that corn crop's going to take up all of that 150 pounds of nitrogen. But I just told you only half of it makes in the crop. The other half comes from organic matter. So 75 pounds of that 150 you applied might make it in the crop. The other 75 pounds, it's actually more than that, that crop needs, is coming from organic matter. If half the nitrogen that your crop needs is coming from organic matter, and the soil biology isn't working, it's not mineralizing organic matter, your corn's going to turn yellow. And then you're going to think you screwed up on your nitrogen application. Really, you didn't. You screwed up on your pH and your soil biology wasn't working. So get your pH right so everything's working the way it should. And nitrogen management's a lot easier. You don't have to throw nitrogen away down, frankly, down your drain that you end up drinking later. That's why we're having these meetings, right? Again, The essential role of phosphorus. Why have I got a phosphorus slide and a nitrogen recommendation, or a nitrogen presentation? Really, you need all your nutrients working well. Get the other things right. Get your phosphorus right, get your potassium right, have a good sulfur program, get your micronutrients right, and you can be more efficient with your nitrogen because your crop's going to perform well, and more importantly, the soil biology is going to perform well. Soil health is a real thing, and it's not just a real thing because it's a buzzword right now. We've been working with soil health, the entire history of mankind as we try to grow crops. So get it right, and everything else will work smoother. One of the reasons for this slide, though, is to show you why nitrogen is so important. So of the big three, N, P, and K, that's your relationship. About 3/4 of that need is nitrogen. Another 20% is potassium, and only 10% is phosphorus. Now, phosphorus is the next most limiting because there's less of it in the soil, as far as likelihood of limiting crop yield, but nitrogen is extremely important. All three of them go together. Get them all right, you can be most efficient with all of them. This is a plant tissue test. Not everybody's used to looking at these, but this is why nitrogen is so important. These are percentages up to this line, and then we drop to part per million. It takes 10,000 part per million to equal 1%. So we're 4% nitrogen in this V7 corn. That's why nitrogen is so important. It's the largest by volume nutrient in that crop. Now, carbon and hydrogen and oxygen, they'll be a higher percent. But the things that you're applying as a farmer, and we've talked to you about as an agronomist, nitrogen's number one. Potassium's number two, and it's kind of close, and it makes you think, well, gosh, that slide was wrong. This is a leaf tissue sample. So the grain contains 4 times as much nitrogen in it as potassium. And this slide here is total uptake through the growing season. Nitrogen is very important. It's the most plentiful nutrient in the plant, and in the grain it's by far the most plentiful nutrient. So, there we go. The nitrogen cycle. I got a lot of background stuff here before I even talk to you about trying to be efficient. But if you don't understand the cycle, you really can't gain the efficiency. So, we take atmospheric nitrogen, which is 78%, the atmosphere, the air you're breathing, 78% nitrogen. Even with COVID in it, there's not that much difference. That's also how we make nitrogen fertilizers. We use the Haber-Bosch process to combine nitrogen, N2 gas, which is free out of the air, with hydrogen that we get from natural gas, and that's how we make all of our nitrogen fertilizers. They all start as ammonia. We'll make urea out of it, we'll make UAN out of it, but they all start as ammonia. The soil converts ammonia to nitrite and nitrate. If we can keep it in the ammonia form longer, that's a positive ion. It will stick to the negative exchange sites that make up the cation exchange capacity. So the higher your cation exchange capacity is, the more these will stick to it. But bottom line is, once they convert to nitrate, now they're going to be repelled by those exchange sites, and they're going to move with soil water. Our two big losses are leaching, which is very true in our lighter soils, especially our sandy soils, but any soils will leach once you're in the nitrate form, and denitrifying bacteria. That's a little more common in heavier soils because they tend to pond the water more, and in that low oxygen environment, the bacteria will strip the oxygen off the nitrate and make either nitrous oxide or nitrogen gas. We're shooting to get nitrates and maybe a little ammonia into plants. The reason it's mainly nitrates is when plants are growing rapidly, the bacteria that make this conversion from ammonia to nitrite to nitrate are also very active, so the conversion happens naturally. But if you can stop the process here so it stays in the ammonia form, that's what a nitrification inhibitor does, is it stops the process of conversion from ammonia to nitrate. You can keep it in the soil longer. Again, another thing you can do is just don't put it in the soil till the plant needs it, and then you can skip the denitrifying and the leaching. All right, immobilization. A lot of fancy terms we use in nitrogen management. Here's what they mean. Immobilization is taking mineral nitrogen, that's your fertilizers, and that's the stuff that's come out of the organic matter, the stuff that's available to the plant. The only nitrogen that's available to the plant is in a mineral form. Immobilization is when that mineral form nitrogen moves into organic matter. And that organic matter can be soil microbes, that organic matter can be plants, but it's tied up. And what really happens a lot is when you have a high carbon to nitrogen ratio stover, like corn stover, the bacteria that go to break that down need nitrogen to make this process work, and they will take nitrogen away from your soil and hold it away from your crop. That's why if you look at the University of Nebraska recommendations for taking CRP out of CRP and moving to corn production, they add 50 pounds of nitrogen to that because there's so much high carbon to nitrogen ratio stover out there, you need the extra nitrogen to charge the system. The microbial population will take advantage of nitrogen that's out there before it gets to the crop. So that's one of the reasons we do maybe a little nitrogen in a starter of some sort, is to try to concentrate it close to the plant so the nitrogens can't, or the microbes can't get it before the plant does. One of the things that makes nitrogen so complicated is the interaction of the applied nitrogen with the microorganisms in the soil through immobilization and subsequent mineralization, because after they immobilize it later, they die and give up that nitrogen, hopefully to the crop, but it greatly complicates our ability to measure nitrogen status in the soil. Leaching, that's one we're here today to talk about because of all the issues we have with nitrates in our groundwater. It's extremely likely in sandy soils. You need to manage your sandy soils better than you do your heavier soils, although all of them can have leaching. The tipping bucket approach is really important. So a sandy soil might only be able to hold an inch of water in a foot. Once you get over that inch, as water moves in, it's got to infiltrate first, but once you get over that inch, it's moving all these other things with it, including nitrate. So the bucket is you fill the water holding capacity of the soil, but once you get beyond that, it's going to push down through. Mineralized nitrogen from organic matter is just as much at risk as fertilizer. And then if you add tile line, you're just speeding up that process of moving nitrates and some other things through the system and out into surface waters. Denitrification. Microbes that can't find oxygen in the soil, and it's a specific bacteria, will strip oxygen from nitrate and convert it to nitrous oxide or nitrogen gas. That just spent the fertilizer dollars, it just wasted the fertilizer dollars you spent by draining it off into the air. It's more likely in poorly drained soils. Any water-saturated soil is going to have some denitrification. If you've got a lot of high carbon residue in that soil, it's going to accelerate it, and warm temperatures will accelerate it. Nitrous oxide is a greenhouse gas. It's 300 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So for every pound of carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide that gets emitted into the atmosphere, it's like 300 pounds of carbon dioxide. We're going to have to pay more attention to this. And then this is what we're trying to do in agriculture, is get it into the plant that we're trying to grow. Some of the best ways to do that is delay application, or at least some of the application of nitrogen into the growing season when the plant's rapidly growing, or try to stop some of that conversion from ammonia to nitrate so it stays in ammonia form longer and isn't subject to either leaching or denitrification. A thing to keep in mind is when you're growing corn, it's going to take out 0.8 pounds of nitrogen per bushel. So it needs to take about 4 pounds of nitrogen per bushel. If your nitrogen use efficiency drops below 0.8, you're actually taking out more nitrogen than you applied to the system, and you're mining the system. It's not all bad, especially if you've got some other forms out there, like your irrigation water's high in nitrate. I've been raising legumes in your rotation pretty commonly, but be a little careful. Some guys say, "Oh, I got my use efficiency down to 0.6." Well, either you're burning up organic matter or you've got some other sources going in there. This is why nitrogen management is so tough. This is brown silk corn and R3 soybeans on my own family's farm in western Iowa. This is an 8-inch sample. Here's how many pounds of nitrate are in the soil at that time. Very little. This is probably, so the equation is depth in inches times 0.3 times the part per million gives you pounds. So this is somewhere around 3 to 5 part per million to get this pound number, basically. Not a lot, and that's common in a rapidly growing corn crop. It's got good biological activity. It's cycling that nitrogen as it needs it. There's not going to be a lot of nitrate showing there. Ammonia is normally the same thing. There's going to be ammonia going into the soil as organic matter breaks down before it converts to nitrate. What happened here? That's very unusual to have 120 pounds of ammonia in a soil sample in July at an 8-inch depth. Something peed there. Wasn't me, I'm not that stupid. I do pee in the fields, but I don't stick the probe in the same spot. But for whatever reason, when I pulled that sample, something must have urinated there. That's where you can get high ammonia. There's the organic matters. Here's the pounds of organic nitrogen in each one of those samples at an 8-inch depth. So we're working over here off nitrate and applied nitrogen at, 100 pounds per acre, 150 pounds per acre, total that we're applying to try to keep a decent amount of nitrate available to the crop through the growing season. Against that backdrop is all this nitrogen in the organic matter. That's what makes this whole system so tough to manage. And the book values will tell you for every percent of organic matter, there's about 1,000 pounds of nitrogen. That kind of holds true here, kind of holds true here. Doesn't hold true at all here. So even though the books tell us one thing, the reality in the field is there's a tremendous variation in the carbon to nitrogen ratio of your organic matter. And that's what makes nitrogen so darn tough to manage. All right. Nitrogen is the #1 mineral element that limits yield in plant growth. Tissue, any plant tissue has relatively high amounts of nitrate in it. We saw that before on the leaf sample where we were at 3.9%. But typical is going to be somewhere between 1 and 5% nitrogen in that plant. Phosphorus and potassium are often supplied by the soil parent material naturally. There is no compounds natural in the soil that other than organic matter that have nitrogen in them. So you're not going to have the mineralization of soil in the future providing extra nitrogen. That's why we have to add so much into the system. It's a complex cycle. We talked about the cycle. We also talked about how much was in that organic matter. Ammonia is a plant available form, and it's the form that isn't going to be lost in the soil. But because it doesn't move with water, the roots have to grow all the way to it. Nitrate moves with water. It moves to the plant via plant transpiration. It's bringing water into that plant. Nitrate's moving with it. And that's great for getting nitrate to the plant. It's not so good for keeping the nitrogen in the soil when the plant needs it, especially if there's not an actively growing crop there. When you don't have an actively growing crop, water's going to tend to move through the system. It's going to take nitrate with it. That's why we have high nitrate in our water. Nitrogen shortage stands out. Short plants and yellow plants, because of the lack of chlorophyll, is a standard symptom of a nitrogen deficiency. It's the most likely yield limiting factor we've got out there in plant nutrition and in agronomy other than water or sunlight. Our recommendations. This is CVA's nitrogen recommendation. 1.2 times the yield goal, minus the soybean or alfalfa credit. Soybean credit for CVA is 40 pounds. Alfalfa credit is 100 pounds if it's good standing alfalfa that you tore up as part of your rotation, not because the alfalfa looked like crap. If the alfalfa looks horrible, it's got a lot of foxtail in it, it's not really alfalfa anymore, it's more of a grass. Minus your irrigation water credit, and the numbers I use, Dan had a nice chart there, I use the expected amount of water that I have planned to apply times the part per million of nitrate times 0.225 gives me my water nitrate credit. And then minus your carryover credit, and we like that 2-foot deep sample. Some people will go with 3-foot deep, not a huge fan of that. I think in heavier soils it takes a long time for the crop to get to 3 foot, but there's some validity to it. So for an example, I've got a 210 bushel dry land corn yield goal, 2% organic matter, previous crop of soybeans, 25 pounds of carryover nitrate in that 2-foot deep sample. 1.2 times 210 gives me a starting figure of 252 pounds of nitrogen. I take off 40 pounds for the soybean crop. I take off another 25 pounds for the carryover nitrate, and my nitrogen recommendation for 210 bushel corn is 187 pounds of nitrogen. that looks more accurate than it is. Don't get caught up in 187. If you're within 20 pounds one way or the other, you're doing pretty good. If I'm within 50 pounds, sometimes I feel like I'm lucky, because you can be way off nitrogen. And there's just so much that Mother Nature's working against you, because she's got this huge pool that if it varies by 0.25% how much mineralizes, throws everything off. And you can't predict it. If you can predict that, you should get into commodity trading and get the hell out of farming. University of Nebraska's recommendation. What this is based, so we tried to make ours kind of as an agronomist common sense recommendation. There's nothing wrong with the University of Nebraska recommendation. Richard Ferguson was actually helped with the defense of my master's project. I got a lot of respect for him. He loves this equation. I don't love it quite as much. What this 35 is here, that's just a math guy making an equation. That's the y-intercept for some regression curve, which is fine. You know, you do a lot of math, you plot it out, this is what you get. So 1.2 times the yield goal plus this 35, minus the carryover nitrate. Here's where University of Nebraska really just makes me a little nervous. This 0.14 times your yield goal times your organic matter percentage. What this is it's an adjustment for organic matter, but it's bringing in kind of a simple version of soil health. It's saying if you've got good yielding soil, use that as a multiplier for your organic matter, and then that can become your organic matter percentage. So if your yields are poorer, then they're saying basically the biological activity won't be as good, your organic matter isn't going to mineralize as much. If your yields are better, they can have more of an impact, positive impact on mineralizing some of this organic matter. Sometimes people don't catch the fine print. They say that this recommendation is only applicable to organic matter of 3% or lower. If you have 3.5% or 4%, that number is 3. Don't put 3.5 or 4 in that equation. It's 3. If you got 2.5, it's 2.5. If you got 1, it's 1. Minus other nitrogen credits, and then they've got a price adjustment factor. You know, that's too much math for me. I'm only an agronomist, so I don't do that much math. So that's why we have a simpler equation. But for the example, I put in 350 corn, 40% nitrogen, applied pre-plant. So the pre-plant is, if you're going to be more efficient, you're going to spread out your application more, you could have a adjustment factor. You don't need quite as much. That makes sense. For my example, I was 210 bushel corn, non-irrigated, 2% organic matter, and 25 pounds of carryover nitrate, and we were figuring spring application. So my timing factor was just a break even. If you were doing fall application, I think that's a 1.1. If you're doing a split, I think that can go down to a 0.9. They give a little higher credit for the soybeans. So everything that's red here is different than the cooperative's rec, but it's still a reasonable rec. 35 plus 1.2 times 210, so of course you do the multiplication first. You get 287, subtract off of that 25 pounds of carryover nitrate. Here's your factor for organic matter. So like, if the co-op actually didn't take organic matter in there with their recommendation. I used to do it when I was at Midwest Labs. My adjustment that I used on my own family's farm was 10 pounds for every % of organic matter. The labs is only 8 pounds for every % of organic matter. But in this case, for the university, with this yield goal, they're giving you basically 30 pounds adjustment for every % organic matter, or a total adjustment of 59 pounds nitrogen credit. That number kind of makes me nervous, but as long as you get good growing conditions, that should happen. It does make yield a little bit, your yield goal a little bit bigger of an issue, because you get kind of a double whammy. Subtracting off 45 pounds for the soybean credit, that gives me 158 pound base recommendation. They're saying that the price of corn is advantageous to the price of nitrogen, so they up the rate a little bit based off of that, and you end up with 164 pounds of nitrogen. We're 187, same scenario, they're 164. To be honest with you, if I'm within 20 pounds, I can feel like I'm pretty lucky. How do I improve my nitrogen usage? So I just did about 20 slides and spent 25 minutes to finally get to the slide that Dan was looking for. Match application crop uptake, especially match the conversion of N to nitrate to a period of high crop demand, V6 to R2 in corn. So V6, it's kind of getting ready to take off. From there to blister, it's rolling. And it needs nitrogen, and that's the time to get it there. And water, generally, your rainfall levels are going to be a little bit lower. You know, if you're irrigating, obviously, and you're not over-irrigating, you're not going to be pushing through, the crop's going to take that up. You're not going to lose much nitrogen to leaching, and you're not going to lose a lot of nitrogen to denitrification. So if you don't put it there until the crop really needs it, that's the best way to improve use efficiency. Minimize loss of any applied nitrogen through urease inhibitors. We didn't talk about this. Urease inhibitor is all about urea, which urea can be urea or the urea portion of UAN. It's placed on the soil surface and converts to ammonia on the soil surface and volatilizes off. By inhibiting that reaction, which is what a urease inhibitor does, we hopefully get some rainfall, or you run the pivot around and wash that nitrogen in the soil so you don't lose it. If you're injecting it under the ground, you don't need a urease inhibitor because it's already in the ground. Nitrification inhibitors are all about stopping the process of nitrifying ammonia into nitrate. If we can stop that process and keep it in ammonia form, it's not going to be liable to loss until hopefully when biological activity picks up and crop growth picks up, and we'll match this. Maximize crop diversity, including legumes, to take advantage of free nitrogen you can get from soybeans, alfalfa, legume cover crops, whatever. Soil health, maximizing your biological activity, good soil drainage, good diverse crop rotation, cover crops. The more your soil biology will help you mineralizing some of that organic matter, the less nitrogen you'll have to apply on your own. Build organic matter over time. That's a lot easier said than done. Make use of alternative sources, such as manures, compost, some of the waste products you can get. Be a little careful with them. Some of them can add some salts and some other things that aren't so good. But you know, taking advantage of the resources you have so you don't have to just buy nitrogen all the time. Measure your nitrogen sources. What's your carryover? What's in your irrigation water? What are your legume cover crops going to supply? That's a tough one to figure out. And then use a fuel gauge at critical points. The pre-side dress nitrate test, so around V4 to V6, get out there. If you've got banded fertilizer out there, anhydrous ammonia or a big 2x2 or something like that, you try to stay out of that as much as you can. What I'll do sometimes is take a tape measure with me and move my sampling points 3 inches across a 30-inch row, so my 10 cores are evenly split there, and 1 core out of 10 should be in the anhydrous band. That works pretty good for me. The stock nitrate test at the end of the season, just as an autopsy to see how I did. Use that information to make adjustments. But probably the biggest thing is still number 1. You can split up the application of nitrogen. That's your biggest opportunity to increase efficiency. Questions?